microphone to get the audio.
I knew there was something. And can I move this aside so that you will not be blocked by the...
Hello, everybody. This is Julian.
Does that work?
Welcome
very
to...
Sorry.
Jeneline, you're talking through my introduction.
Sorry. Hi.
Jeneline. Blah, blah. Welcome to the week 8 class. If this is your very first class, welcome. Every class is standalone and can be enjoyed by itself. You don't need to have any previous knowledge of philosophy, of Zizek, or ideology. We're very happy that you're here. Thank you for being part of our learning community. And if you'd like to download the reading list and the study guide and the masterclass, and you can also join the seminar for this, all that stuff is on our Patreon, which is at www.patreon.com-
Jeneline and Julian.
Jeneline and Julian. So thank you for joining our class. These classes sort of have their own dynamic. I teach, Jeneline gets to ask questions, interrupt, and then on Friday we reverse and Jeneline teaches,
Yes.
and I get to interrupt. That's sort of the dynamic that we have. And we've been doing this for the past year. All the classes are 100% free. These lectures are not podcasts. They're genuine lectures. They're designed to be audited, listened to. Of course, if you'd like to ask questions in the chat, you can. We try to sort of monitor them. And in this class, we're going to be continuing our discussion of Zizek and ideology.
Excellent.
So that's pretty much it, I think. So welcome if you're joining us for the very first time. We're very glad that you're here. And if you'd like to learn more about us, just click the link in bio. You can find all the information about our project and why we're doing this.
Yeah, I think there's a Substack subscription link in the bio, and that's just the free newsletter that we send out periodically about the project and what we're doing and how things are going and what we're thinking about and how we're trying to expand what we're doing and keep doing cool new things.
Yep.
So thanks for your support.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you to our patrons who have kept this project alive. The only reason we can keep these classes free for everybody is because we have a small group of patrons. You know who you are, so thank you very, very much. We're steadily approaching 100 patrons. When we get to 100 patrons, we're going to have a big party, a big release event. We're going to start releasing our own writing, so
Yes.
that's something that we're looking forward to.
That's the next step.
So, but only you guys can get us there. We're currently at 84 patrons, I
Oh,
think. Yeah.
that's getting
We're gonna
pretty
lose a
close.
couple at the end of the month, though. So like we should aim for like 100 too, maybe. Okay, shall we begin?
Yes, and as soon as you begin, I'm gonna jump out and get the coffee.
Are you getting coffee for us?
Yeah.
Thank you.
There you go.
Are you like going right now?
Well, what's your preference?
Either way, I can begin. You can go. Are you heading out now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I'm
Bye.
gonna miss the introduction. I feel bad.
That's it. Don't worry. There's nothing to miss here. Okay. Jeneline is kindly procuring us 2 cups of coffee because it is 8 a.m. here, so it's relatively early for us. Okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a very quick recap of where we ended the previous class. The previous class we were talking about what is Zizek's theory of ideology, because Zizek talks a lot about ideology. Speaking of glasses, you know, he often plays this game where he puts on the glasses of looking through ideology and he sort of reads the world around him, and that's very entertaining. But we were trying to say, well, what is Zizek's theory of ideology exactly? And what we did in the previous class is that we essentially said Zizek uses the Lacanian term, Lacan being a French psychoanalyst, Jacques Lacan, the Lacanian term of the point de capiton, or the quilting point. And he uses the idea of the quilting point to suggest that when we pretend that things are inherent or natural in the world, that we come up with an abstraction that we use to justify that. For example, if you ask somebody, what is a society? They might say, well, a society has to be free. But of course, freedom is also an abstraction, and so on and so forth. Here's Jeneline. That always feels quicker, you know? Like when I'm talking, like time flies.
It's gotten quicker, you know?
Oh.
It's taken us a year to figure it out, but I think we might be getting there.
Did you actually bring our own milk today?
I did, as a matter of
Ew,
fact.
I love that. That's excellent. That's so chic. Okay, so I was doing a quick recap of the previous class, but
Yes.
you don't need to know about that right now. If you want to look up all the information about our previous classes, the summaries, the study guides, etc., you can find that on our Patreon. I'm going to say one more time, www.patreon.com/Jeneline and Julian. That's basically where we put the key concepts, the summaries for every class, if you want to find that stuff.
Well, and the other thing about watching the older classes is I sometimes find that it's in the rewatching or the re-listening or the rereading that stuff actually makes sense. And so if I do it the first time around, I kind of get it, but I'm not certain. But it's only when I go back to previous stuff. So we design the classes, I mean, not super intentionally, but so that they can be watched both in a forward direction and a backward direction. So it's not like this class is somehow more than previous classes. It's
Yeah.
like-
Yes, students will know that these classes are taught in a dialectical fashion, and that's an expensive way of saying that it is a choose-your-own-adventure lecture, which means that we're not teaching 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Instead, if you are dropping in here for the very first time, this is your starting point, and the other classes will resonate with everything we're saying here, because you could literally go to the next class and treat that as the second one, or you could go backwards and treat that as the next one. I'm just gonna jump right in.
Yeah,
Okay?
let's get
Okay.
into it. Have a sip of coffee. Have a savory
Thanks,
sip
yeah.
of coffee.
Oh, that's really good. I want to start with a TV show, an old cartoon show called The Flintstones. Do you remember the Flintstones?
I remember the Flintstones. I don't think I ever saw the Flintstones.
Do you remember the theme song for the Flintstones?
Meet the Flintstones.
Yeah, meet the Flintstones, the
The-
Flintstones.
dun,
Da,
dun,
da,
dun,
da,
dun,
da,
dun.
da, da. Like the thought. That's right. It's a great jingle. And so the premise of the Flintstones. Do you know what the premise of the Flintstones is? First of all,
They are cave people, a cave family.
Mhm.
They have sort of like modern conveniences with sort of mysterious Stone Age technology. So they have like a pet dinosaur and.
how's a pet a convenience?
Well, I was trying to think if they rode their dinosaur, but they had a car, didn't they? Didn't they have a car with like
Okay,
stone
you've
wheels?
gotten the basic elements
Okay.
right, which is that the Flintstones is a family. You could say a nuclear family, sort of a typical 1950s family, and they're a family of cavemen, cave people. They're sort of like the Croods in that sense, except for one key distinction. The film The Croods has a cave family that are distinctly of that era.
Right.
And we've actually talked about the Croods in another lecture. There was some foreshadowing going on there. And the key gimmick of the Flintstones is that everything that exists in the modern age, everything that exists in a 1950s family sitcom is reproduced, except it has to be reinvented to be done with dinosaurs. So for example, the Betty Friedan type woman who's at home doing the chores will be vacuuming, but instead of having a vacuuming machine, she'll have a dinosaur that like eats up all the dust and stuff like this, right? Like you're gonna say?
Well, is her name Wilma?
Wilma,
I feel
yeah.
like that's the one.
Yeah.
That's the one
And
thing I
Fred.
do remember. Fred and Wilma. I mean, what's funny is, of course, that dinosaurs did not live at the same time as humans. And yet, this is like the fictionalized excuse they have for all the technology. Sorry, anyway, that kind of bothers
No.
me.
Oh, no, it doesn't. I like that you're having, like, your point of disbelief is the dinosaurs can't live at the same time as humans.
Yes.
As opposed to dinosaurs can't live in harmony with humans. But okay, fine. I want to sort of move on, but the reason that I'm introducing the Flintstones here is we have here this world of cave people, and everything is being done as if we're the 1950s. Except the gimmick is, as I was saying, that it has to be recreated without the technological advancements of the 1950s. And so what we're having here is essentially apart from it being a gimmick, it's also that everything in the cave world has to be seen through the lens of what if this were potentially a form of technology. Right? So you take a society that has no technology, like a car, and they have to use their feet to like run the car. That's the famous Flintstones car. It's just like the bottom is open, but they're just using their feet. And so it's funny, obviously, but this is actually a really, really good example of the kind of ideology that we're going to explain here, which is that ideology sees a gap in the world, a certain incompleteness, and fills in that gap. And basically suggests a certain completeness that, quite importantly, is consistent. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is like when we had the Lacanian nodal point, the point de capiton, the quilting point, is that one thing will then quite systematically, and yet of course arbitrarily, fill in the meaning of all the things that are unfilled.
Right.
In the same way that the gimmick is the nodal point for the Flintstones, which is that all the absences of technology are filled in consistently and arbitrarily through that central gimmick of creating technology.
Right.
Does that make sense
Yeah,
a little bit? Yeah? Okay. So that's something that I'd like you to keep in mind as we sort of build up this class. You and I were buying plants, this house plants in particular. Generally and I went on a house plant buying spree. I think we could say this past week. And what are some of the house plants that we got?
We got green ones.
Green ones, yeah, green ones.
I'm not a houseplant person.
Japanese orchid,
Yes.
which is kind of amazing because it's like multiple orchids and it's overhanging.
Well, we should. Well, if you're really into it,
Yeah.
Evidently, there is a way of bundling the root ball for an orchid in moss that is a Japanese style of horticulture, and I can't remember what
I
it's
keep
called.
wanting to call it edamame, but it's definitely not
It's
edamame.
definitely
But it
not.
sounds like edamame.
It'll come back to me, but it's very interesting. So that's what Julian means by Japanese orchid.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because it has it's like the holy hand grenade of orchids, basically.
Yes.
It has like this globe at the bottom of it and then the top sticking out. Anyway, Jenny and I were going to the plant store and we were surprised to find that we were probably the oldest people in the plant store. I'm not even kidding, right? I mean, people were young. It was a Gen Z hangout place. And we felt, of course, very relevant, very hip. But it also occurred to me that Gen Z hangs out in plant stores the same way that you and I used to hang out in record stores. And that was kind of interesting because the behavior of these Gen Zers in the plant store was like being in a record store. They were just milling around, looking at familiar plants and discussing like the terminology and how they were into that plant before other people got into it. You know what I mean? Like, it was the same social experience, essentially, which I thought was sort of interesting. And when we exited that, there's a point to this story. When we exited this plant store, the place where we live, Spokane, Washington, is a place of many contradictions.
Yes.
And one of the beauties is that many cities have, it's very segregated. So you can go to one part of town and it's where everyone's really into guns. And then you go into one part of town and everyone's really into plants. In Spokane, those people just live side by side. Like, it's a little bit like in Europe, you have fraternities. And usually in Europe, there's one street where all the fraternities are lined up. And so, for example, in Holland, like alongside the canals, and all the fraternity and sorority houses are literally next to each other, which means that when they go out drunk onto the street, they inevitably will run into each other. And so brawls, like massive, genuine fist fights, handicuffs, as they used to call them, break out in the street, inevitably as part of the fraternity sorority culture. I know this not because I was in a fraternity, but because all of my friends were in fraternities. And it was this one street. It was like gangs of New York, except for overprivileged, drunk,
Dutch kids.
white Dutch kids. Exactly. And, okay, so something similar happened in Spokane, which is, I mean, there hasn't been a fight yet. But right next to the plant store is another store, and I don't even know what it sells.
It's a pop-up shop that sells homemade, hand-drawn posters of protest,
Right.
declaring the importance of the Second Amendment, and handguns, as far as I can tell, and
Yeah, they
probably
sell-
candy.
Yeah, we sell guns too. Yeah, exactly. Here's my watercolor of Adolf Hitler.
They definitely need more plants.
And so it's kind of funny because, like, when Jill and I were living in London, there's all these pop-up designer stores. The big trend is that because rent is so expensive, that people will buy a large company or investor or fund will buy space and then essentially lease it out to like small business owners. I mean, it's like pop-up design, whatever.
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
this is like the pop-up design of like the militia, far right, all of
Yes.
this, and everything is. They've got like big banners, and one of the big banners at the front says, "What is it? Freedom still lives here." And I thought that was kind of beautiful. Like, the idea that freedom was like basically like a tenant there, like a resident.
Yes, that it has been evicted elsewhere and is seeking refuge
Yeah.
in the last place where it can find
Yeah, and there's
center.
weird Christian overtones, of course. And so, anyway, the reason that I'm setting this up here is that in the plant store and this little hole-in-the-wall store, there, if you went into both those stores and you asked those people what their definition of freedom was, you would find you would have a very different answer. In fact, this is true for most people. You ask them what freedom is, you'll get a very different answer. If you ask a traditional humanist liberal, they'll say something about freedom is about individual expression, it's about the Enlightenment. You ask someone who is more on the leftist perspective, right? They would say, well, freedom is about collective belonging. You ask someone who's a conservative, they would say that freedom is the capacity for the individual to assert themselves over others, etc. Like, the way in which you fill in freedom functions in a very gimmicky way, which is that depending on your political alignment, you will fill in freedom differently.
Can I actually do a very small political economy riff?
Yeah,
Because I was
sure, yeah.
reading about this weekend, because this has always kind of fascinated me. It turns out that the sort of parallel to this is the notion of liberty in politics
Right.
and political writing, and that in the Magna Carta there is an interpretation of liberty that essentially means the aristocrat's right to maintain a monopoly on something. So whether it's a business charter or a business license, that is technically the origin of the meaning of the word liberty.
Right.
But of course, so in this sense, liberty is about a restriction to operate a business. It's essentially a business license. But the way that liberty subsequently came to be used, either interpreted in the courts, but also publicly interpreted through particular liberalizing social movements to expand the right to vote, etc. Liberty came to be my political freedom to not be limited by the government. So we have sort of opposite meanings of the word liberty. I thought that was really interesting how it sort of reversed course over time. I know that liberty and freedom are two different concepts, but
No, it's quite interesting. No, thanks for that. No, and I'm really glad. There's totally space for that. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
good. When I used to teach my introduction to political science class, and I don't know if anybody in this live stream was a part of that. One of the things we'd always do was we begin with, if you have liberty or equality, how do you reconcile the two? And so do you veer more towards liberty or towards equality? And then the students would have to identify what do they think of under liberty, what are the associations that they have with equality, and then what is the trade-off? And usually students would find within the span of 45 minutes that you can't actually have them in full equanimity. And part of it's also a trick question, because equality, you're asking about the equality of equality. Do you see what I mean? And so what ends up happening is that I sort of wrap up the class in a very optimistic fashion by saying, well, that problem that you've just described, the problem of liberty and equality, and never fully reconciling it, that is the process of living in a democratic society. That's sort of one of those things that we do that you may have had.
feel good exercises.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's one of those classic intro to political science classes that hopefully raises enough questions that students then want to pursue that question themselves. But what's important here, I was talking about different conceptualizations of freedom, and what's interesting about the store that was selling the homemade guns or whatever, I don't know, and
Slingshots.
yeah, slingshots, was that for them the idea of freedom was specifically that they'd been denied freedom, that freedom was something that was under threat, and a form of victimhood, and that freedom was something that had to be guarded against those who would rob you of your freedom. Freedom in the sense being like a commodity almost, like something that you can have or that you can't have, and that you have to guard.
Right.
And these gun people are not the only people who are guilty of making this kind of assumption. You could even go to the grand dawn of analytic philosophy, Bertrand Russell, or Karl Popper. And Karl Popper writes about how we have to guard the truth against all the untruthful dialectical thinkers, the these fuzzy abstract philosophers coming from the continent who are going to tarnish irrevocably
Very nice.
the truth, and that the truth has to be guarded. And who's going to guard the truth? Well, of course, these are the Oxford Dons and the analytic philosophers and the guardians of rational enlightenment English male cisgender, basically. And so this isn't something that is, strictly speaking, unique to that gun store. In a sense, you could say the same for truth. You could say it for freedom. You could even say it for justice. We have all these abstractions that we say that we are the guardians of, or that we protect. And that is always an ideological move. Because one of the things I did in the masterclass, and you can download that masterclass on our Patreon, is I was talking about the relationship of the double abstraction here. Mm-hmm. And a couple classes ago, we talked about that with Adorno or Marx, with how the commodity form goes from like use value to exchange value. And that then the exchange value has to then be certified or formalized, so it's a double abstraction. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that again. If you're joining us for the first time here, this should be self-contained, but you can go back for that. So sticking with that idea for a moment, we're talking about the two stores, the tale of two stores, in a sense. We have the plant store and we have the homemade gun store. There's something that I always think about there. Which is that you and I have a show that we really like. I forget what it's called. It's the guy who did Peep Show. It's a skit. It doesn't matter. I don't know the title. It's fine. Yeah. I can post a clip of it. And it's basically a skit. You may have heard of this. It's a comedy bit taking place during World War II. And you see like the Nazi, I don't know, the SS shock troops or whatever are advancing on God knows what. They're basically advancing on some position. It's like they're in the trenches, basically. World War II. And these shock troops are dressed in their finest leather outfits and caps, their Hugo Boss designed regalia with the skull and crossbone and all that stuff on it. And what's the premise of the skit? Do you remember what the skit's about? Can you do a little exposition?
It's the whole, the punchline is, are we the baddies? Mm-hmm. And he's sort of our protagonist is sort of looking at all of the insignia and the paraphernalia and the all black and the leather and the eagle and the skull and crossbones and saying, wait a second.
Yeah.
Are we the baddies?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, someone on the YouTube chat already guessed it. Yeah, are we the baddies? It's sort of one of those classics. And he sort of looks around his commander and says, are we the baddies? In a British accent. And
it works because he's so baby-faced. I can't remember his name.
But there's so this is actually really important because one of the things about whether it's through Marx or through Zizek and all that ideological recognition, and this even goes back to Hegel, it's not that you've changed something, it's that you've suddenly changed your own perspective on something. Yeah, someone says Mitchell and Webb, exactly.
Yes, thank you.
The Mitchell and Webb show. And so nothing has actually changed about your position. Mm-hmm. It's that you suddenly inverted your own take on it, and the truth of it or the nature of it comes out. And so this is kind of a joke that I have, but let me put it like this, because I have to put on my own blinders here. This works for everybody. So for example, when we're here and I see like a giant black truck with spikes on it and like, I don't know, they put like bumper stickers on it that say something like, we're here to crush your communist, blah, 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 all this like, and like skulls and like, I'm not even exaggerating. Like a lot of that stuff is common where we live. And I always have this like imagination of like this guy in his giant truck, like suddenly thinking like, are we the baddies? Or like even with the gun store, it's like they literally had like, cross like skulls up and flags and all those things. And it's like, you can buy your guns here. And it's like, is there a point where they look around and they say, are we the baddies? But what's important here is that is in as much true for that whole bunch of Gen Z plant shoppers. And so this is the important point here, is that you could also be in the plant store and suddenly look around and you see cacti, you see inanimate objects, you see that you're not actually with people, you're with plants, You know what I mean? Everything is like in a process of decay. You know what I mean? Like suddenly
Desperately trying to preserve life because you live in a world that is covered in pavement and you have no genuine access to nature, and so you're trying
Exactly.
to bring the
You're
artificial nature into your...
You're trying to spruce up your tiny little apartment
Yes.
with this little plant that costs like $50. Meanwhile, we have forest fires everywhere. And then there's like that moment where you go, are we the baddies? And so what's really important here is you don't have to be a Nazi to have an awakening moment. That is universal. And if anything, like the more it's presented to you as you are the good guy, the harder it is to say I'm the bad guy. And so it's easy for us to say, oh yeah, the Nazi SS shock troops, how didn't they realize that they were the bad guys, right? But where you really have to say, are we the bad guys, is next time you're at one of those like climate neutral festivals where Coca-Cola is sponsoring everything and they're giving you vegan chocolate and you're having a plant-based food party and all that stuff. Like that's the moment where you have to go, are we the baddies? It's really important to be able to do that.
Yeah, because if I can go back to one of the earliest classes that you did, we said, and I think that this is quite important, that ideology is not some veil that you can remove and suddenly the world will be revealed as it is, or glasses that you can remove and suddenly you'll see the world as it is. And so there's a temptation to have the are we the baddies moment and think, I'm victorious, I have recognized my own flaws, I have recognized the ideological infrastructure or structures that mask the reality of the world, and now I can see the world as it is, and now I'm free. And that's just as much of a mistake as the ideological buildup.
No, it's really good. And more importantly, let's say like the Nazis, the stormtroop guys with the black coats and the blood, they thought that they were waking up.
Yeah.
Remember, the premise was you are being oppressed by a grand Jewish conspiracy and the Rothschilds and the other families that have basically been secretly running the world. And by wearing the skull and crossbone and by putting on your cap, you are embracing the true German awakened Aryan identity. I mean, the narrative of awakening and liberation and of looking through ideology is the very way in which ideology functions.
Yes.
The Nazis thought that they had seen through it in
Yeah.
the same way that, and it's a crude analogy, but in the same way that the vaccine deniers think that they've finally seen through the pharmaceutical industry, etc.
Yeah.
And the truth here is, yes, of course, the pharmaceutical industry is completely rigged and evil and all of that. Of course. But they're not evil by means of giving you the vaccine. They're evil by keeping prices artificially high. They're evil by means of not giving vaccines to poor countries. They're evil by means of creating patents where nobody can produce life-saving drugs. That's the structural evil of the pharmaceutical industry. It's not that you should take a horse dewormer paste and that's your moment of liberation. Do you see what I mean? Like, and so there's a recognition that takes place, but it's not the correct recognition.
Yes.
And so whenever someone is telling you that you are the one person who has seen through it and that you now are awakening to the evils of something, that's usually when you're being fooled. And so the are we the baddies moment is important here because it's suddenly realizing that process. Anyway, I don't want to dwell too much on that, but I think that's sort of where we're heading here a little bit. So Zizek's theory of ideology hinges on this moment of recognition or non-recognition. Because what we said in the last class is that everything in the world is a floating signifier. In other words, everything in the world exists, but needs to be contextualized. And we talked about how children hystericize. Children ask, why? Everything has to be a system of meaning.
Yeah.
Why is something a chicken and something a seagull? Why are they not just all seagulls? Right? Or all chickens.
Or all chickens.
Yeah. That's what we talked about last week. And so what Zizek does using Lacan here is he says, at a certain point, there is a signifier without signified. There is a pure abstraction that we nonetheless pretend contains the answer. For example, we don't know what a society is, so we tell ourselves, well, we can't define society, so instead, society equals freedom. And freedom is a total abstraction, but we've decided that freedom is like the you know when you open a wine bottle and you put like the stopper in it so that the wine doesn't go bad. We've that's the stopper. Freedom is the thing that we put on top. We close it.
Yeah.
And so, what's important here is that seemingly fixed thing, that stopper that stops the chain of signification, that fills it all in. Because of course, if your conception of freedom is it's freedom to have guns, it's freedom to fight communists, it's freedom, etc., then that becomes the answer to all your problems. Why am I hurting? Oh, it's because of the communists. Why am I no longer allowed to wear masks? It's because of socialism. Why, and so everything has an easy answer. It's you're putting that stopper in the wine bottle. And the same is true for a lot of leftists. Oh, it's because of capitalism. Oh, it's because of imperialism. Oh, it's because of you have this easy, ready-made answer to everything that, in a sense, closes and forecloses what is this total complexity. Now, the mistake here would be to say that we have to, celebrate complexity. Just get rid of the abstraction, rid of freedom, get rid of the idea of, oh, it's capitalism, and look at the complexity. They're, in a sense, interrelated. I'm going to explain that a little bit more. The thing that you use to foreclose that chain of floating meaning, for example, I don't know what society is, it's freedom. That consensual element is actually a perpetual site of contestation. I'm going to explain this a little bit more clearly. If you ask somebody in America, liberal, middle of the road, humanist, perfectly decent person, what is the most important thing in American politics? What do you think they would answer? Soccer mom, soccer dad? What is it that we keep bemoaning that we no longer have in American politics?
Oh, civility?
Civility, yes, perfect. And specifically, what's the political expression of civility?
Not being on Twitter? I don't know.
Bipartisanship.
Oh, okay.
So I realize I was very...
No, that's okay.
So bipartisanship. The idea that if only we could work together again, everything would be fine, everything would be good. This is the classic consensualist, liberal, humanist narrative.
Yeah.
That politics is the process of finding agreement between two parties, at least, that disagree, and finding something that you can make compromises on, and then formalize that compromise into law. That's the idea.
Yeah.
And we constantly bemoan the fact that there is no consensus anymore. People used to be, as you put it, so civil. For Hegel does a lot about civility, like a Sittlichkeit is what he calls it. And if only we could go back to being civil, then politics would be so much better. But what's really important here to emphasize, not only the fantasy of civility, but specifically the fact that every consensus has to be enforced. There is no such thing as a genuine consensus between people. There are always ways in which the consensus is enforced. And a really good example here is, sort of a dramatic example, but it's the Augustinian reign in the Roman Empire and the Augustinian peace. And we have here a period of peace in the Roman Empire that is considered the longest era of peace. I guess, 100 years? Is that 100 years? Yeah.
Yeah.
And in which Rome has no conflict. Of course, if you're a historian, you will be quick to... Augustus had a portal, like a gate. It's like the... It's like an arc.
Yeah.
What's someone called in Paris? The
Arc de Triomphe.
Arc de Triomphe, like one of those built. That was the Augustinian peace, and we're only going to build the second one at the end of all this stuff.
Well, and there's all this romanticization of the whole Pax Romana and
Pax Romana. That's the word. Yeah.
And we idolize the Roman Empire for being a model of strength through peace, and they were able to maintain their hegemony through their own power, and they didn't have to fight militarily.
Yeah. And it's an interesting thing. The Pax Romana, thank you very much. This is always, when someone says a pox on both your houses, you should always say a pox on both your houses. Peace on both your houses, because that's, in a sense, it's worse. Like two families that have decided that they have to get along. And this is actually in Bertolt Brecht's Mutter Courage play. She's sort of with her cart, right? She's got the Gingelwagen. Gingelwagen is something that Kant also uses. Kant refers to, it's untranslatable what a Gingelwagen is. It's like a cart. And Kant writes about the idea of the Gingelwagen of, I think it's like Western philosophy. It's just a compilation of little bits and pieces that are all jangling. Anyway, Mutter Courage, Mother Courage, is carrying her cart throughout the war-torn landscape, and a missionary, or whatever, emissary, I should say, of the state comes and declares that peace has now arrived. And Mutter Courage, in a very ironic, sarcastic, Brechtian sense, says the eternal words, "Don't tell me that peace has broken out." And it's perfect, right? This is very Brechtian in a sense. Don't tell me that peace has broken out, because peace is usually conceived of as an absence of conflict. But of course, what peace really is a formalization of a frozen conflict, of a status quo of conflict. And so when we go back to the Pax Romana, what we have with the Pax Romana is, it's not that there was an absence of conflict. I mean, there were plenty of border skirmishes going on all the time. There were plenty of what today would be clear war crimes going on everywhere.
Gotta do something with those soldiers.
It's that officially it was deemed a peaceful time, and there was no significant opposition, both domestically or abroad, to convincingly make the case that it was not an era of peace.
Right.
In other words, there was a hegemony of Roman power. In the same way that, like, a country like Turkey can proclaim to be the most thriving democracy in the world, and nobody thinks Turkey is actually a functioning or let alone thriving democracy, let alone the Turkish leaders, and yet there's not a sufficient force to contest that notion. You see what I mean? And so what's happening here is that precisely when we have the declaration of a grand peace, of a consensus of we're all getting along here, that you know that under the facade of that, it just means that one party or one state is so overwhelmingly powerful that they can enforce the notion of everything being fine. And the same is true for the idea of bipartisanship and consensualism. When the two main parties in the United States can say everything is back to normal and civility, and now we can just have, bipartisanship, it means that the resistance to the backroom dealing of American politics has gotten so weak and pathetic, and the lobbying has become so powerful that we can pretend that it's two people having an honest dialogue and coming up with a law.
Coming up with the best solution.
With the best solution for everybody, because there is insufficient resistance to it within society. And so what's very important here is this, I'm not being cynical here. Like, there's actually a point to this, because we could very easily say, oh, well, it's all rigged anyway, blah, blah, blah. Who wants to go on?
I'm the token cynic in this.
No. The point here isn't to be cynic, but it's to point out something very important, which is that conflict and antagonism, and specifically struggle, is something that exists in all things. It's a principle of life, and certainly a principle of politics, or the political. And that where struggle and conflict is actually most present is precisely when we're told that there's an absence of struggle, when something is natural or inherent or consensual. And the same is true for ideology. We are most in ideology at the exact point that we are denying that ideology is at work. You see what I mean? And so that foreclosure, that suggesting that something is inherent or natural when it is actually fabricated or constructed, is a key ideological point.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think about, is there something that is genuinely consensual in society that doesn't need to be articulated or reinforced? Because it's so obvious. I mean, as soon as you need to say that something is, bipartisan or consensual, or this is what we've agreed upon, then there are always going to be people who will say, well, I want to undermine
the perfect.
This. Yeah.
I take your point, and we can clarify a bit further. The perfect example of this, and it's a very tricky, very problematic one, is that the question of the role of consensus in sexual encounters. Because certainly today, there's an attempt to be more transparent about sexual violence and to make sexual encounters more consensual. And at the same time, it is undeniable, and I'm willing to defend this, that every romantic encounter contains a small moment of violent transgression. And I don't mean that in terms of you grab someone violently, but there is a certain passing of an acceptable limit.
Yeah, transgression. I wouldn't say violent, but I would say transgression.
That takes place. We can take away the violent if it's too confusing, but I mean it's violent in terms of it's forcing a shift in the status quo.
Yeah.
Where you go from a non-romantic encounter towards formalizing it. And the problem is here. Let's say there's two people and they've gone through the process of courtship and flirtation, which is deliberately ambiguous.
This is the other great online skit, is the couple who's making out and they decide that they're going to have sex. And then their lawyers sit up and start negotiating a whole contract of the sexual encounter.
Yeah, the lawyers come out from under the bed.
Yes.
It's actually the, I forget what his name is. He's the guy who directed Up in the Air and a whole bunch of comedies. That was his student film that he submitted to a student festival. But it's a very tricky situation because courtship is inherently ambiguous. Otherwise, it wouldn't be courtship. You see what I mean? Like the process of trying to ascertain if somebody is sufficiently into you that they would enjoy a romantic or sexual relationship with you has to be ambiguous. If it's not ambiguous, it's no longer a romantic encounter. It's simply like a grinder, like
transaction.
I actually really like the name of the app, Grinder, because when you reduce sexual encounters to the biological immediacy, it is grinding and humping. It's a distinctly unpleasant thing. And so I like how upfront they are about that, because what happens is that we mystify that biological process of getting smelly and rubbing up against each other, and we call that love or sex. And the reason that we can call it that and imbue it with those emotions is because we need that ambiguous exchange, which is that of courtship.
Yeah.
And the problem is that what we've identified as being the problem here, which is the moment of transgression, that moment which is not consensual, is in a sense retroactively necessary. And I'll put it like this. When you have consensus, like, yes, I'm going to sleep with you, or I'm going to let you kiss me or whatever, that moment comes as a formalization, as a dotting of the I of something that could have been non-consensual. And this is one of those terrible things when it comes to like rape trials, which of course we should have, and we should take rapists to account. I'm not an apologist in any sense here for sexual violence, but that it is very, very hard to determine for people at what point was something part of the sexual conquest and at what point was something a violent sexual transgression. And of course, you think for most normal people, you say, well, it's obvious. If she says no, she says no. If he says no, you know what I mean? Like, and yet one of the problems is that we experience intercourse as the formalization of a certain ambiguity that requires at least a little bit of a forcing of the situation, because otherwise it becomes farce. You don't just sit down and negotiate the terms of your sexual, yeah, right?
Yeah, and I think that part of what's challenging about it is that what you're suggesting is that ambiguity is the fundamental aspect of what makes a romantic encounter, like what completes it. And yet if that ambiguity is never mutually acknowledged and reinforced and built upon, then you have the potential for misunderstanding, for miscommunication, and that is what can explode into sexual misconduct.
And what you're saying is really important, which is that it is most likely to be a form of sexual violence if you're emphasizing the consensual element oh yeah, I thought we were all okay. I thought that you liked it when I forced you onto the bed, etc. And I'm not trying to trigger anybody here, but this is like part of it. We have a comment coming in, which is a very good comment, from Satyasya, saying, what about like kinks and fetishes and those types of things? And so what's really important here is that one of the beauties of the kink or like a sexualized fetish, for example, like a dominatrix type thing, is that it's actually a lot safer than the ambiguity. It's a little bit like rock climbing. I've said this before. Rock climbers are, it's one of the safest sports because it's one of the most dangerous ones. Rock climbers don't court risk. They're more risk aware. And this is like, you're more likely to die falling down the stairs or slipping in the bathtub than you are to go out doing something dangerous. Because when you're doing something dangerous, you formalize that encounter. Everything in climbing has been formalized into a risk assessment. The same is true with the kink. In the kink, you've taken the danger, the transgression, the violent underbelly of the, oh, this is wonderful courtly romance, and you've made that the thing, and so suddenly you have safe words and you have all the other things. What's dangerous about the underlying violence of the sexual encounter is the repressed element, that it's not acknowledged. When you bring it to the forefront, it's a perfectly safe thing to enjoy. And so this, to go back to my original riff about consensualism, is where consensus becomes dangerous is when it does not acknowledge the repressed element of consensus, which is those resistances that can no longer be made manifest. You're pretending like everything is harmonious by means of repressing the inherent antagonism of the political itself.
Yes.
And you're going to say?
Yeah, no, I have a really trite example, of course, that you would not bring in because you did not, for your own sanity, did not watch Bridgerton. But that is the dynamic in Bridgerton, is that there is a couple that is really having difficulty in their courtship of other people. And so they say to each other, let's make an agreement to pretend to be courting, but we're not actually interested in each other. And of course they fall for each other because that's how fiction works. But
no, this is how life works too.
But they're able to have this negotiation. They're able to build this consensus and this consensual relationship under the pretext that they're not having a relationship. And that's what adds. And so even in the act of building a consensus, that is what brings tension to their relationship. Yeah,
it's really good. I feel I can't contribute to the Bridgerton discussion. We watch everything together, and it's one of the few things that I just can't watch beyond a certain point.
It's important to test the limits in a relationship.
I know. I mean, if you go back to like comedies from the 1980s, like Ghostbusters, for example, the way in which the male leads approach the female parts is distinctly rapey to our current sensibilities. And it's almost like they take like a vulgar Marxist approach to success, which is like, you just have to fail enough, and then the failure will suddenly retroactively turn into success. It's like, if you badger a woman enough, she will eventually consent to you. And this is of course a terrible approach to romantic
I mean, there's
encounters.
a whole genre of movies that are like, if this ever happened in real life, someone would be in jail.
Pretty much. Yeah. But you know, that's the, from a screenwriting perspective, and the transition from the 80s to the 90s is the romantic encounter in the 80s is very much, I'm just going to keep on trying, and the woman doesn't like me, but eventually she's going to realize that actually she loves me.
Because I'm not going away.
See, but actually this is more true to life than what happens in the 90s, because in the 90s they have to get around this problem. And so the screenwriters create the beautiful, completely unrealistic concept of the meet cute. And the meet cute is where two characters who are now no longer allowed to have sexual tension, because sexual tension is no longer allowed, have to accidentally cross wires or meet. And the famous one is, of course, two people walking in the park and the leashes of the dogs get intertwined, and then they have to like unfold it, and then their heads bump together, or they're both picking up something from the floor and suddenly their bodies meet. There's this enormous shame in a very Puritan sense about bodies actually being together on screen. Sex, of course, is not allowed in general in Hollywood, and so we have to make the romantic encounter as contingent, as accidental as possible. That's the transition from the 80s to 90s. Of course, you go from the 80s to 90s to the noughts. The evolution of this is that we just don't have romantic leads anymore in general. Like, people just don't fall in love. Like, we live in an oddly sexless universe, Hollywood universe, and that's only continued, I'd say. To the point where characters just don't have... I mean, there's literally movies where...
it's about divorce. That's now romantic comedies is like a marriage story.
True. It's more... I think the marriage story is more sophisticated than what you're suggesting.
Yes. No,
but
I should be nice.
What happens now is that there'll still be like a female and a male lead, and there's all these scenes where we think they should be falling in love, but they just don't have the time. There's too much going on in the background. There's too many monsters exploding everywhere. Like, for me, the logical conclusion of like the Kong Godzilla movie is that they make out at the end, and that the two human figures are standing in the background, and like I don't know, flames erupt, and like Godzilla just like completely French kisses King Kong. That is the movie I want to see. Okay, I've lost everybody here. I'm glad you think that's funny. Okay, so we have this process here, and so what I'm trying to point out here is that conflict, antagonism is inherent, and it's taking place precisely when there's a strong avowal that there is no conflict, and a consensus, in a sense. A consensus always belies that there's an unacknowledged struggle or tension that has already taken place. Someone in the comments says that there is a fan-made video of that lol. I don't even want to go. This is like, I'm sure there's like a porno somewhere where someone's dressed up as Godzilla. This is terrible. Okay, let's keep moving on. And so the reason I'm introducing this is that this is actually something that Zizek doesn't come up with on his own. Remember, this is still an introduction to Zizek's theory of ideology. And specifically, Zizek is drawing upon the work of Ernesto Laclau, who was a longtime friend of Zizek's. I think they had a falling out or something, but I don't know. And Chantal Mouffe. Chantal Mouffe, a very well-known French, and I should say female, probably, which I guess noteworthy because the leftist circles tend to be very male, very old, very white. And Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau are the two thinkers who together have really reconceptualized and rehabilitated the notion of antagonism and struggle. Of course, when we hear the word struggle, we think in a Marxist sense of class struggle. Everything was about class struggle, and specifically that the working class was the peculiar class, because it had been created by history. There is no natural working class in the world. The working class is an arbitrary result of the inequities of the industrialization and of capitalism. At least that's Marx's argument. And because of this plasticity of the working class, the fakeness of the working class, there's no primordial inherent being to the community of being working class, save for the conditions of exploitation and the reproduction of capitalism, that class had the unique capacity, according to Marx, to, in a sense, become the universal class. It was like the internal limit of capitalism that had to suddenly look inwards and have that moment of realization. That's the Marxist conception of class struggle. But that's specifically not where Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe end up. Because one of the questions, and we'll explore this in the later classes, is who gets to decide what class is the universal class? And the Marxist argument had always been, well, yes, feminism, and well, yes, race studies, and well, yes, all of that. But when the working class is emancipated, everybody else will be emancipated as well. It's like all falls under the umbrella of that.
Yeah.
And so to be the universal class means that you will, it's the, I don't know, what is it? The ship that draws all other ships. What's the metaphor here, the image?
Oh.
Something that draws everything in its wake.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Something like that.
All the particular battles ride on the coattails of the Marxist working class.
Yeah.
And one of the revisions within post-Marxism and also the work of Ernesto Laclau is to say, well, how can, quote unquote, particular battles, like, for example, for women's rights or, I don't know, for all other kinds of rights, how do they navigate that problem of universality? Because again, from an ideological perspective, if you're a feminist, you are likely to see all the problems of the world in terms of a feminist problematic.
Right.
if you're a critical race theorist, you will say most things lead back to race.
Well,
And so-
yeah, and it's important to remember that some of those particulars maintain their own prejudices, and this is one of the legacies of the women's rights movement in the United States, was that it was not advocating for Black women. It was not advocating for the political rights of Asian women, for example. So,
Yeah.
so these particulars are still particulars in a limited sense. Yeah.
Well, to use a technical term
Yeah.
here, what's become fashionable in academia within the last perhaps 10 years is the idea of intersectionality and the importance of intersectionality between these groups. And a lot of that discussion comes from what Ernest Delaclau and Chantal Mouffe were doing about antagonism. And the term that Chantal Mouffe uses is agonism, actually. So it's not antagonism, but it's agonism. And this is more than just a semantic game, because the word agonism is the Greek word for struggle. And what agonism is it's actually a celebration of conflict. For example, like for the Greeks, it was about the athletic prowess of competitors. And it's about elevating the human experience by means of conflict. Conflict becomes a principle. Conflict becomes actually a civilizing tool. However, if your proto-fascist alarm bells are immediately going off, that is for a reason, because Chantal Mouffe takes the idea of agonism, antagonism, from the work of Carl Schmitt. And Carl Schmitt was one of the key Nazi legal theorists who was trying to codify a certain principle and theory of antagonism into the very legal system of the Nazi framework, in which everything had to happen by struggle. Now, I don't want to make an analogy between Nazism and the Soviet Union, because that would be too crude, but this emphasis on struggle also has a distinctly Hegelian influence, which is the idea that everything, it's about the unity of opposites, second law of dialectics, and the negation of negation. You see what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
for Mao is very much like Carl Schmitt in this sense. It's like you only move forward by continual clashes and forcing contradictions into irreconcilable collision. Mao, of course, I mean, I hate when academics say of course, because they always say of course when they mean something that isn't of
They
course.
want to paper over.
Yeah, well, not even that, but it's like everyone should know this, when they always say it for something that nobody knows. So I'm not going to say of course. It's one of my things I'm trying not to say. But Mao, not of course, Mao didn't believe in the negation of negation. Mao just believed that collision and forcing contradictions into explosion was a perpetual forward movement. And Hegel's much more nuanced about this, right? But this is a whole nother class. So the idea of antagonism as being a central principle of the political and even of, you know, human experience, and the rehabilitation of conflict is part of Chantal Mouffe's project. And I've put more about that in the reading notes if you want it. So I realize that we're sort of running out of time here.
Yeah.
I actually was going to do a whole bit on Freud and Marx, which we may have to push towards the next class on hegemony. If you've downloaded the reading list and the study guides, you'll actually see the section I was going to do on Freud and Marx. So that is exclusive for patrons. You can go to www.patreon.com/JulianJulian. But let's wrap up because we have a couple minutes left. So Zizek's theory of ideology draws upon Chantal Mouffe and Ernest Delaclau's theory of antagonism and the idea that conflict is inherent. And ideology is taking place in those aspects of life that are trying to tell us that there is no conflict, that there is unity. But let's go back to the image of the store that says freedom still lives here. You would think to yourself that they are all about conflict, right? Oh, we're being oppressed by socialists, we're being oppressed by the government, blah, blah, blah. But secretly, underneath that narrative of victimhood is an ideological falsehood, which is that freedom is actually a unified thing. That freedom is not abstract but concrete. That freedom is something that has to be guarded, that you can keep under lock and key. That freedom is a real thing. And so what happens is that that conception of freedom fills in the blanks of all the other political contestations. Suddenly everything is about freedom. And freedom isn't designed to work that way. You can't suddenly take something and elevate it to that pinnacle. And for Zizek, we do this with everything in life. Everything in life has to be filled in by an abstraction. This is the double abstraction, what he calls pure difference. We abstract what it means to be in a society. We abstract what it means to be human, what it means to be in a friendship, etc. And then we formalize that abstraction by a double abstraction, which we pretend is so concrete that we're willing to die for it, right? It's the thing we stand by. And that process of double abstraction, for Zizek, is what he calls pure difference. And the reason pure difference, we talked about this last week too, is a form of identity thinking, is that the only way to pretend that that thing is totally concrete, like freedom, is to make your own identity the pinnacle of it. I am in the embodiment of guaranteeing that freedom is not an abstraction, but that freedom is a real thing. And I stand for that.
Yeah.
And so identity thinking emerges at the exact point at which you're trying to close a gap between what is already a double abstraction. I realize it's a little bit obtuse.
It's flags.
A flag is actually a really good example, right? Or an anthem or anything like this. And so it's really important to understand how conflict is an important part, because conflict and struggle is taking place precisely where we think that everything is natural, everything is unquestionable. It is. And so what we're going to do in the next class is we're going to talk about hegemony, because we've been constantly leading up to the term hegemony. Because hegemony is one of those terms that you may have heard, but it's not entirely clear. What does it mean to live in a hegemonic system? What is the process of hegemonic struggle? What does it mean to live in a society in which you can also resist ideology without just being suckered into being even more ideological? So our next class, which is going to conclude this triad of lectures on Zizek, is going to be about hegemony. Thank you very much for watching our class today. It has been our pleasure to teach you. Julian and I are actually going to be hosting a seminar right now. So if you go over to our Discord, you can join our seminar. It's going to be in the Discord voice channel as well as on Clubhouse. It costs just $5 a month. And if you go to www.patreon.com/Julian and Julian, you can join all of our seminars. You can download all of our reading lists, our study guides, not just for this class, but for every class we've ever taught in the last, I don't know, since we started this.
Yes.
And you can download the masterclass, which is a 10-minute video with more or less professional production where we boil everything down, because not everybody has time to watch a full hour, and you'll get access to our entire back catalog of masterclasses.
Yes.
So if you'd like to help support keeping our classes free, if you'd like to give us a little bit of a financial thank you for this, a monetary incentive, please go to www.patreon.com/Julian and Julian, and that way we can keep these classes for free forever.
Yes, and if you just want to keep track of what we're doing, we have a Substack subscription in the link that is free. And you can just sort of keep up with what we're doing, because we really enjoy growing this project and hearing from you. So thanks very much.
That's right. It's been our pleasure to do this, getting to teach exactly what we want, having full control over our classes, and doing it together. That's been the best part. We never got to teach together when we were still at university. So thank you, everybody who's joining us for the very first time today. I'm going to send you a little follow-up message, because it's really important to us that this actually feels like a community. We invest a lot of time and energy into making this a genuine community. So thank you for being part of our learning community, and we shall see you all next week, or you can join us in the seminar right now. We're going to head over to the Discord right now, where we're going to have a seminar based on this class, and we can just riff for another hour. All right. Thank you, guys. It has been our pleasure to teach today.
Yes.
And thank you for learning with us.
Yes. Take
All
care,
right.
everyone. Have a nice week.
Yeah. Bye-bye.